Hi, my name is Carey Roesel. I am Vice President Consultant with Inteserra Consulting Group, a Fastek company. And this gives me a good opportunity to explain what that means. Inteserra and Fastek have merged, and so our new title will be Inteserra Inc., again, a Fastek company. What that does is it finally brings together two very important functions that have been separate for us. Inteserra on the consulting side and on the regulatory compliance side has not had an indirect tax solution, and now we do. So with bringing Fastek and Inteserra together, we can cover the full spectrum of regulatory compliance, indirect tax, sales and use taxes, regulatory solutions, and consulting into one place. So we're excited about that, and that officially will begin January 1st, 2022. I'm going to now share my screen and go over today's presentation. So this session has a bit of a grandiose title for what it is: VOIP service providers, everything you need to know about your federal and state obligations. Well, there's a lot to know. And so for me to title it everything you need to know is maybe a bit of an overstatement, but hopefully provides an overview of what a VOIP provider needs to know in terms of compliance. I think many providers in this space are worried about unknown regulatory landmines. There are things that they don't know they need to worry about. And in this session, we're going to provide an overview of the changing regulatory environment, specifically what might apply to you, what definitely applies to you, and which things are worth obsessing about. I will say there are regulatory landmines all over the place. Again, you don't need to necessarily lose sleep over it, but you do need to be aware of it. One of the problems is that the delineation between specific VOIP provider types is becoming more complex with overlapping categories. So if somebody says, I'm a facilities-based VOIP provider, or I'm nomadic, or I am non-interconnected, those all have very specific meaning within the regulatory environment. Somebody might say, well, I don't think this presentation applies to me because I'm a UCAS provider or a CPAS provider. Well, what you'll find is in regulatory world, that is not really a category that regulators speak of. So what I've done here is included a list of what the federal USF Form 499 lists as ways to describe a telecommunications company. And so you won't see unified communications up here. You won't see a lot of current acronyms for provider types, but you will see many traditional service types. And these are things that you have to choose from. If you are a UCAS provider, you are very likely going to check that you provide interconnected VoIP service, for example. So before you dismiss some of these regulatory activities or regulatory obligations as applying to you, you want to be careful that you understand that there is the terminology within the telecommunications environment, and then there's a terminology within the regulatory environment. There's a lot of similarity there, but the regulatory world has a little different lingo than does the current telecommunications environment. We have interconnected, non-interconnected, fixed, nomadic, over the top, facilities-based. You can be a reseller. You have managed VoIP. There's a retail versus wholesale distinction. You have one-way VoIP, and this is just some of the specific types of VoIP that we're going to be talking about. And as I said before, these overlap. You're not just one of these categories. You may be picking 3 or 4 of these categories that occur simultaneously. And if you're going to comply with all of your regulatory obligations, you really need to know what type of provider you are. It's not enough to say you're a VoIP provider. You need to know what type of VoIP provider, and it depends on what functions you provide, how you provide those functions, and you in this sense you are what you are. You don't change your categorization based on the regulatory environment. I mean, unless that's if you want to become a certain type, you can be that type, but you can't just declare yourself to be a type. You are based on how you provision service, what your relationship is like with the customer, and all of those details will determine what type of provider you are in the regulatory space. The way I've described this session, what might apply and what definitely applies, it generally means which things apply based on your VoIP service and provisioning characteristics. It does not mean, for example, that the application of the regulation is simply unknown. Now, what you will find is there are gray areas within regulatory questions. Most of the things I'm covering here are not gray. And when I say something definitely applies or maybe applies, it means based on your categorization, based on how you provide service and the characteristics of that service, a regulation may apply to you. And so if we know exactly how you provide service, what type of provider you are, then we can, of course, tell you what applies. So we can take the mystery out of what applies. It's not that we come into it not knowing and then it's just a mystery to everybody, but we need to know the details of your service. Let's talk about what might apply. And again, this is based on your service characteristics. Federal Universal Service Fund. That is now limited to interconnected VoIP. If we go back to the previous slide, you can see that's one of the categories on the FCC Form 499. And so you will be responsible for Federal Universal Service Fund contribution if you are an interconnected VoIP provider. You also need to do a Form 477. Now, this is also limited to interconnected VoIP. So it may apply to a VoIP provider, and the maybe part is if you're interconnected or not, then if you are interconnected, then yes, it will apply. International 214, probably not applicable, but that may change. This is something we've been working on for quite a while, and there are discussions about the applicability of the International 214. CP&I, Customer Proprietary Network Information. Again, this is a requirement, an obligation that's limited to interconnected VoIP providers. I've mentioned interconnected VoIP several times, and it may have been, I probably should include, I have not included in this presentation a description of interconnected VoIP. You can definitely contact me if you'd like to know more about that, but it is most of the VoIP applications that you're used to working with probably fit in the category of interconnected VoIP. So if somebody just says they're a VoIP provider, in my opinion, it is most likely that they will be an interconnected VoIP provider, and these obligations will apply. CALIA, Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement. This is what gives law enforcement the ability to participate in tracking criminal activity and identifying criminals through the call data that's available. And then we'll talk about this more in just a little bit, but the reassigned number database. The reason I say this might apply, this is something that really does apply, but it's one of those things where the responsibility can be shifted to an underlying provider, but that handoff needs to be very clear. You can't assume that your underlying provider is going to take care of this obligation for you. It needs to be very, very clear. On the state side, we've been talking about the federal obligations, but on the state side, about a third of the state PUCs require at least VoIP registration. Now, as we get into the last bullet here, many of the states are prohibited from regulating VoIP, but it doesn't mean they can't require registration. They are, in many cases, prohibited from having any sort of a market entry test where they determine whether you're worthy of entering a market like they do on the CLEC side, but they can have a registration. So about a third of the states have a registration requirement. Interestingly, I think 98%, almost every state imposes ongoing compliance obligations. These are mostly related to 911, state USF, and telecommunications relay service. So while only a third require registration, almost every state imposes some sort of ongoing compliance. So if you see a state that doesn't require registration, please do not think that that state does not have other obligations that it will impose on you. And when you enter that market, you need to be aware of what those are. The requirements, like with federal USF, with federal obligations rather, requirements can vary by type of VoIP provider. So some state obligations apply only to fixed VoIP. Some only apply if you happen to be a wholesale provider of VoIP. As I said before, many states are statutorily prohibited from regulating VoIP, but that does not necessarily mean that the PUC is completely hands-off. The PUCs interpret these rules differently in some cases, and you'll have to make a decision about whether you're going to rely on a statutory prohibition or if you're going to let the PUC determine the regulatory obligations that apply. You may disagree, but it may not be something you want to spend energy arguing with the PUC about whether regulation applies or not. We will do that. We work with the state PUCs on clarifying regulations all the time. But individual companies probably don't have the time and energy to want to do that. Let's talk about what definitely applies. So before we're saying this may apply depending on your service type, but this is what definitely applies to you if you are a VoIP provider, and it is Form 499. Now, if you think back, I said federal USF maybe applies because you're only obligated to pay federal USF if you are interconnected VoIP. But you have to do a Form 499 even if you are a non-interconnected VoIP, because other assessments are driven by the 499 as well. So whether you're interconnected or non-interconnected, you will need to do a Form 499. This is probably one of the obligations that gets missed the most, and it can really wreak havoc on a company to miss that obligation. You also have to designate an agent for service of notice, a DC agent, if you're going to be operating as a VoIP provider in the United States. You also have to offer 911 service, 988 suicide prevention. You need to comply with accessibility by people with disabilities. There are call blocking obligations. So these all apply to VoIP providers, both interconnected and non-interconnected. State requirements, what definitely applies, whether you're interconnected, non-interconnected, resale, wholesale. If you're operating in a state, you need to have Secretary of State authority. So this is beyond telecom regulation. This is just the ability to operate a business, to have served customers in a state. Do not neglect your Secretary of State obligations. So this slide is one I really want to focus on, because we've talked about what things that may apply, things that definitely apply, and then those are things y'all have to do. But which things are worth obsessing over? Literally the things that could destroy your business if you didn't comply. These are the things that if you were to lie awake at night worried about regulatory and compliance, these are the things that would actually be worth the stress of doing, because they're so important. On the federal side, Federal Universal Service Fund is, with its nearly 30% assessment, is on interstate retail revenue, is something we have seen time and time again destroy companies. We've seen companies overpaying in the USF. We've seen them under contributing. We've seen them not participating in federal USF, in some cases for years. And it's worth noting that this is an obligation that will not go away. If you have not complied, you need to become compliant, and you need to address past non-compliance. If you don't, it will come back to haunt you in a variety of ways, and is something that if you were to look at one regulatory obligation, I don't think I can emphasize this enough, if you were to focus on one regulatory obligation, you'd want to be very, very careful about Federal Universal Service Fund, also known as the 499, and make sure you are contributing, you are participating as you're supposed to. You don't want to over contribute, of course, You don't want to under contribute. You want to make sure that what your contribution is, how you're assessing customers, how you're reporting is aligned. You don't want to go through a Federal Universal Service Fund audit and be found to owe money, be found to be non-compliant. This is just, in regulatory world, this is the biggest single thing you can obsess over and worry about. And this is something worth getting some expertise to support your company and make sure you are handling Federal Universal Service funding correctly. That's the big one. But we recently have seen Robocall Mitigation Database. This is a regulatory obligation that came about pretty recently. And the FCC is very serious about robocalling. And if you don't comply, if you are non-compliant in terms of being part of the Robocall Mitigation Database, you may have found yourself, or maybe in the future would find yourself, with the inability to route traffic. This is an unusual regulatory obligation that gets right down into the service and says to other providers, if this provider is not part of the Robocall Mitigation Database, you shall not route traffic associated with them. So this is something that can bring your business to its knees very quickly and cause you to lose credibility with your customers. So again, not to belabor the point, focus on Federal Universal Service Fund, Robocall Mitigation Database. These are things that can really wreak havoc if they're not taken care of. I want to issue one final warning about compliance. These compliance obligations are yours regardless of what type of provider you are. You have certain obligations to comply, and they are your obligations. The underlying service providers can help in some ways, but they have limited ability to comply on your behalf. So if it is your view that your underlying carrier is taking care of these obligations, I would say think again. I would say to review these obligations and make sure that anything you're relying on your underlying carrier to do on your behalf, I would be extremely cautious with that. The biggest example of that is when you're a small provider. If you fall into the de minimis rule for federal USF, if your assessment is less than $10,000 per year, then your underlying provider can treat you as a retail end user, pay USF on your behalf, and charge you USF as if you're a retail end user. You still have to submit a 499. You're just a de minimis filer. And so for a while you're de minimis, your underlying provider can and will pay USF on your behalf, and you will pay it to the underlying provider. And you want to manage that transition carefully. Once you become past de minimis, then you will be a direct contributor. You will no longer be de minimis. Your underlying carrier needs to know that you're not de minimis and that they need to stop charging you USF because you're a direct contributor, and you're going to give them an exemption certificate, a whole nother area of compliance, but you're going to give them an exemption certificate that says I am a direct contributor. They will stop charging you. But that transition is very tricky. You're getting charged this 30% assessment from your underlying carrier. You go out of de minimis status, you become a direct contributor. Now you're contributing that 30% directly to USF, to federal USF, and you don't want to pay it twice. You want to have your underlying carrier stop paying. So managing your compliance on your own, managing your own compliance obligations rather, and then understanding what your underlying carrier can and cannot do is extremely important. So I hope this has been a good introduction to some of the obligations. It's not meant to scare anybody, but there are things that are extremely important about regulatory compliance, and that is something we want to always make sure providers are aware of and help them wherever we can. Thanks very much for listening.